This morning, as we continue the series on the greatest gift, I want to tell you a little bit about where you might find information about what we're going to talk about today. As I'm always researching and looking for new ideas, I've been thinking about this message for about, 16 months now, and been waiting for the chance to share this one with you. But I've borrowed heavily from three sources in case you want to download or look more into it. One is a guy named Ray Vanderlaan, but the series where he teaches on this doesn't come out to this June from Focus on the Family. But the other resources come from a place called Mark, a commentary on his Apology for the Cross by Robert Gundry. And again, this is a commentary, so it's not an interesting book to read, but it's a great resource for getting more into a text. And then a guy named Thomas Schmidt. You can go to the BAS library, and if you Googled Jesus' Triumphal March to the Crucifixion and the Roman Procession, you could actually get a yearly subscription to biblical archaeology and read all kinds of interesting things. So if you're interested in getting more into this topic, those are some sources that you can look at. You see, if you lived in Rome, if you were a Greek or a Roman, you were very familiar with kings and Caesars. In your whole life, you've known what it meant to be under the thumb of an emperor. And therefore, your role of leadership and your understanding of leadership also came from seeing how the emperors and how Rome controlled things. You see, emperors, their leadership style was always about sacrificing their servants for the sake of the king. Oh, you would go and you'd be fodder for the Roman machine, so the legacy of Rome would go on. You might die, but that's okay because the emperor was exalted because of your sacrifice. The Roman Empire was expanded because of the loss of your brother or your father or your son. The king always sacrificed his servants for the sake of himself. Now Mark has a challenge. He's writing primarily to Greeks and Romans, although certainly there are Jewish Christians who will read the book as well. But he's got to convince a group of Greeks and Romans who killed off Jesus that his moment on the cross was not a moment of defeat, but a moment of victory. What a challenge. More than that, he wants to describe a whole nother kind of king, a whole nother kind of emperor, a whole nother kind of way of operating. Not a king that sacrifices his servants for the sake of the king, but a new kind of king, a new type of leader who sacrifices himself for the sake of his servants. This was unheard of. A king, an emperor, who would sacrifice himself for his servants? To give to them, to care for them. And as we've seen going all the way back 9 months ago to our String of Pearls series, there's lots of references to the Old Testament. There's lots of ways in which Mark has been able to effectively speak to his Jewish audience with a very Jewish way of teaching, using illustrations, using references to the Old Testament, using word pictures. Even 2 weeks ago, we talked about a Gethsemane, and it comes up again here in this passage. And again, this is a very Jewish way of teaching. Using objects around you to be a platform by which to speak. They came to a place which is named Gethsemane, which over the years I always thought was the name of the garden. A Gethsemane is an olive press. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here and pray." He took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. He said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch." And of all the places Jesus could have taken his disciples to describe the anguish he was about to undergo at the cross, he brings them to a Gethsemane at the Mount of Olives. There were so many olive trees there, they had to have an olive press to crush out the oil. So if you came to an olive press, you would see that there were little baskets that you would place the olives in, and then you would push them down and squeeze out, crush out the oil. But that would only get so much of the oil, so then you would take these giant beams, line them up with giant boulders, and crush even more oil out of those olives. And the more you pressed and the more you crushed, the more you would get out of it the needed oil that you had. And Jesus brings his disciples here to a Gethsemane to say, "I will be crushed, and I will be distressed, and I will be pushed down. And what will come out of me will be a love for my servants. What will come out of me will be sacrifice and the greatest gift. For I've come as the King of the universe to pour myself out for my servants. And just when you think I cannot be crushed anymore, there will be a beam placed upon my back. And the weight of the world will be placed upon me because God Himself will have to turn His back on me as I'm fully and finally crushed. And while I am crushed, what will come out of me will be what is in me. And in my moment of most distress and crushing, what you will find in me is things like this. Father, forgive them, my Roman enemies, my Jewish friends, my friends who betrayed me and denied me, for they know not what they do. In using these word pictures, all of us can appreciate what Jesus is doing and teaching, but probably not a Roman. A Roman would say, wow, well, that's sort of interesting maybe, but that's weakness. That's not boldness. That's not emperor. That's not a king. And so Mark is then going to sort of hint at the fact that he's going to present the crucifixion in a very unique way that the Greeks and Romans would go, oh my goodness, that's kind of like something I've heard before. He mentions this idea that he's speaking of a king. At the feast, he was accustomed to releasing one prisoner to them, whomever they asked. There was one named Barabbas who was chained with fellow rebels. They had committed murder in the rebellion. So the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he had always done for them. But Pilate answered and asked, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd so that he would rather release Barabbas to them. And you remember them crying out in the other synoptic gospel, Barabbas, Barabbas, crucify Jesus. Pilate answered and said to them again, what do you want me to do with him who you call the King of the Jews? And I think this is Mark setting up how he's going to describe how the King of the Jews goes to the cross. But I'm going to press pause. And we're going to take a little journey back in history. Because the audience who had seen a Roman procession, or a Roman triumph, which is referenced in the book of Corinthians very clearly, we'll see at the end of the message today, they knew what a Roman triumph was. They know what an emperor's triumph was. And so, in order for us to get what maybe the original audience got, we need to go back in time and experience what it would be like to have seen an emperor be deified or go to the point of being on procession. And my hope is that when we understand that, we're going to see the crucifixion and its connection to Christmas in a whole new way. So journey back with me as we head to Rome. You see, Rome had a decision to make, having conquered Greece. The decision was, will we be a republic or will we have an emperor? Julius Caesar decided not to be a republic. He wanted to be the first emperor of Rome, to set himself up as God on earth. When he died, a comet appeared in the sky, and they took that to believe that Julius had ascended into the heavens. And his son, the Son of a God, would dwell on earth as his representative. He would be God on earth, the son of Julius. His name is Octavian. We know him as Caesar Augustus, the Caesar of the Christmas story. In order to prove he was God on earth, he also had to take the battle between a republic and an emperor. He joined up with Mark Antony, and they had this incredible battle in the valley against Cassius and Brutus. In the middle of this battle, ultimately, Julius wins, he and Antony. Cassius and Brutus commit suicide. Julius sets up a temple to the god of Mars, the god of war, a way of saying, the gods have declared that I am the emperor, I am God on earth. But he wanted to now set up a way in which he could deify himself, where everyone would know that he was God, and would set up a procession to say such. So on the coins and on the statues and on the artwork, he declared himself to be Emperor, Lord, and God. But he decided to create a way, a ceremony, that had been used by the generals in the past. It was called a triumph. You see, the generals would head off to war, and as they returned, they would bring the spoils along what was known as the Sacred Way in Rome. going through the arches, parading the spoils of the stolen menorah, or the slaves they had taken, or the people they had conquered. In this triumph, people would begin to gather on the streets as the spoils of war would be dropped up on Capitol Hill. The emperor liked what the generals had done, so they said, no longer can the generals do this. We will do this. It will begin by taking the purple robe off the Greek god Dionysus, the dying and rising god. The purple robe would show that I too am the dying and rising god, and I too wear the color of the emperor purple. As the emperor began to walk through the city and parade himself, it was a triumph as people in the army marched together and they said, Triumphe! Triumphe! Hail Caesar, Lord and God! The army was there to show that the forces were behind him, the gods were behind him. He was marching his way to deification. And there were 9 stages to this process. Happened in this order almost every time. Stage number 1 was the Praetorian Guard would gather to hail Caesar. You see, if you didn't have the Praetorian Guard on your side, you were not going to be emperor. So imagine those guards with their helmets and their breastplates standing before the procession before the triumph began. As the emperor comes up, he'd already paid them off, and they would then, before all the crowd, before the triumph began, say, Hail Caesar, God and King! We are behind you. We affirm you are the Son of God and God's representative here on earth. After the exchange of gifts, they would then stand before Caesar and they would take that purple robe off the statue of the god Dionysus, place the purple robe that only the emperor could wear that color upon him, and put upon his head a crown. Not a crown like a metal crown in the storybooks, but like an Olympic crown that you might win at the games. In placing the crown upon his head, it was a reminder this was a victor, this was an athlete, this was the man's man. This person was being crowned on earth as our king. And then they would lead the emperor through the city. And there would be incense going back and forth, filling the city with the smell of his reign. Nero is said to have spent over $1 million in his time, equivalent, in the incense to fill the aroma. The king is coming. The king is coming. The emperor is here. People would smell the city changing. They would come out to cheer the triumph of the Roman emperor. As he made his way through the city, you would notice something. They were headed toward Capitol Hill. And behind the king was a sacrifice marching along with him on the path. Standing next to the sacrifice was the executioner. He was carrying a sword or an axe. This is the sacrifice that would be given to the king when they reached Capitol Hill. The emperor, the sacrifice, and the executioner. As they made their way up, wound their way through the procession up to Rome, they would eventually make it to the Temple of Jupiter. The Temple of Jupiter was up on Capitol Hill. There was a myth that said that when they built the temple to Jupiter, in the excavation before they built, they found an intact human head there. So they named this place Capitol Hill. Literally means head hill. So you would go to Head Hill and go up the stairs of Head Hill to show you were the head of the world. Before you went up to the stairs, you would be given a cup. The cup would be filled with myrrh and wine. The emperor would take the cup, and more times than not in history, he would pour it out. Some said the sign of him pouring out was a sign that he was going to give himself for his people. Many said it tied back to Dionysus, that he was the god who died and rose again. Some say he poured it upon the sacrifice, a way of saying the sacrifice is to me, your God on earth. Whatever it was, as the cup was poured out, you knew you were moving to the next stage of the triumph. People were gathering, the crowds were getting more and more, and now the sacrifice before him would be slaughtered. And as he was slaughtered, prisoners would be brought to him. And he would show he had power over them. He would say, some will die and some will live. Your freedom is my hand. Your life is in my hand. I am the all-powerful emperor. The bull was killed before him. He declared, some prisoners free and some to die, and then he began to ascend the steps. Always with two people. A general, a high priest, a brother, and uncle. Two people at a lower step than him of importance, who would say, we too are affirming that this is our leader, our emperor, our God and King. And as they made their way up to the top of Capitol Head Hill, Caesar would be celebrated as all the people would begin to shout out, Hail Caesar, God and King! Triumphe! 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 And then they would wait. Would the gods affirm what they have done? Would the gods give us a sign like Julius Caesar had a comet in the air, Caesar Augustus had a flock of birds, something that affirmed that the gods agreed that this was his representative on earth? And as they waited, there would be a sign. They might wait minutes, they might wait moments, they might wait longer. Would the gods affirm this process? And if they did, they would declare, in this case of Octavian, Caesar Augustus, that he was God's representative on earth. And that, with a little gladiator music, is a little what it might have felt like if you had been part of a procession. Now I want you to imagine taking that experience as a Greek Roman that you've seen and experienced, and that is what you think of when you think of victory, when you think of might, when you think of a leader. Now imagine Mark, writing to a Greek Roman audience, wants them to know that Jesus' walk to the cross was his incredible moment of victory, not defeat. So he orders the way he teaches the story in such a way to hint at something they knew very well. A new kind of emperor, a new kind of king, one who would sacrifice himself for the sake of his servants. Look what happens in the passage. Verse 16, it begins. Jesus, on his way up to the cross, the first thing he encounters is that the soldiers led him away into the hall called the Praetorium. Why does he mention the hall? Why does he mention this was the place of the Praetorian Guard? Well, they called together the whole garrison and all of the Praetorian Guard in mocking him, but what they did is they stood before Jesus and said, Hail Jesus, King of the Jews! They spat on his head with a reed and spat on him. And then they bowed down before him like they would do to the Caesar, and they worshipped him. And though they did it in mockery, Mark puts this as the beginning of the journey to the cross. The Praetorian Guard are worshiping him. Stage 2. And they clothed Jesus with purple, the robe of royalty, the robe of the king, the robe of the emperor. And they too put a crown upon his head, but not a wreath crown like the emperor would hold. Instead, a twisted, mangled crown of thorns pushed upon his head. And they too gave him a scepter, mocking him, spitting on him, but declaring him to be the King of the Jews. Stage 3, next verse. And they, the Praetorian Guard, led him out in a procession through the city of Jerusalem to crucify him at their final stop at Golgotha, just as what would happen in a triumph for Caesar. Stage 4. Caesar would be followed by a sacrifice. In Nero's case, it was a bull. And sure enough, Mark tells us in the story that Jesus, this emperor of a new type walking toward his procession, has to set down his instrument of torture because a certain man named Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was coming out by country, passing by, and he now is bearing the cross. We now have a king marching his way through the city. He becomes the sacrifice, and someone walking next to him carrying the instrument of death. Stage 5. They arrive at Capitol Hill. That's what the Caesar would do. And he would be offered wine mixed with myrrh, but he refused it and poured it out. Now remember, in the myth of the Temple of Jupiter, there was an intact human head, which is why it was called Capitoline Hill, Head Hill. Mark wants to make sure you know that we are heading up another head hill. We are heading up the place of the skull, a head hill called Golgotha. And they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of the head, a place of the skull. And then, as if telling it out of order, if you look at the other synoptics, He takes something that happened way into his crucifixion, the drinking of the wine, and he moves it to right after he gets to this place. As if there's some reason Mark has chosen this order. And they gave him wine, mingled with myrrh to drink. But he refused it, and it was poured out. Stage 6. The bull would be killed, and the Caesar would pronounce life or death over the prisoners. And again, he tells us Jesus is crucified, and then later gives us details that were almost related to what happened before his crucifixion. They crucified him. They divided his garments, casting lots for them to determine what every man should take. Now it was the 3rd hour they crucified him. The sacrifice would be made before the triumph. Oh, and by the way, Mark wants us to remember, we're talking about a king here. They wrote an inscription to say, "This is the King of the Jews." And just as the Caesar, if you remember the movie Gladiator, would say, "Some will die and some will live," there are prisoners mentioned here, one to his left and one to his right. And in the other synoptic gospels, we know he says to some, "You will be with me in paradise," and other rejected him and will not be with him in paradise. Stage 7. The emperor would then ascend the steps up to Capitol Hill with one to his left and one to his right that would affirm who he is. And here again the King of the Jews, and they crucified 2 robbers, one on his right and one on his left, in this great procession up Golgotha to the top of the hill. And then, where the people would begin to cheer and celebrate, "Hail Caesar, Lord and God," we see our own bizarro version of this in the mocking of the chief priests. The chief priests mocked among themselves with the scribes, saying, "He saved others, himself he cannot save. Let the Christ, the King of Israel..." And here are the chief priests, the people, crying out that he is the King of Israel. Even those who were crucified with him reviled him in the same way. And then as the emperor came to the top of Head Hill, the question is, would the gods affirm that this was his son? Would the gods affirm that the Caesar was God on earth? And Mark puts this detail right after the mockery. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. God in heaven has looked down and said, "This is my son. This is my representative. This is me on earth, and this is why I came. You think this is a moment of defeat? This was me being on mission. I came to sacrifice myself for the sake of my servants. And even the Romans who thought they had power over me by crushing me, by ripping out my beard, by mocking me, by stabbing me, by torturing me, I stood boldly on that cross in my triumph. And I chose when I died. Into your hands I give my spirit." I chose to have the strength in that moment to look at the people and say, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Because when I was squeezed, when I was crushed, and when I was pressed, it was the forgiveness and mission of God that flowed out of me. A new type of king. A new type of emperor. A new type of leadership. 2 emperors. One sacrifices himself for the sake of his servants, in contrast to the Caesars who sacrificed their servants for the sake of the king. Which emperor do you and I serve? Which procession do we follow? In the aroma of that $1 million worth of incense that went through the city, there was a smell of the emperor. There was a smell to know that you were under his reign. It filled the city. It filled your home. It filled your clothes. How will people know which emperor you smell like? Which emperor you serve? If people smelled the incense of your life, would it smell more like Christ or more like Caesar? Would the aroma of your life and mine, would the actions of our life look like we're following the example of somebody who sacrifices everybody to exalt ourselves? Or is there an aroma, as people examine our lives, that says that we are following a new type of leader, a new type of giver, a new type of sacrificer, a new type of triumph, that we walk in triumph when we're allowed to give, to sacrifice, to love, and to care for others? How would you know which emperor you serve? How would others know? You see, an imperial coronation literally means the enthronement of the emperor. This was the process by which he was enthroned as God on earth. It was in the process of his enthronement that he was declared the God of the nation, the God of Rome. And there is a similar process that happens in our heart. And as we go through that process, we ask ourselves, who is enthroned in my life? I want to challenge us to look at 4 thrones. 4 thrones, and ask yourself, who's enthroned on the throne of your life? Of the 4 thrones, if you trace them, do you see more Caesar or do you see more Christ? One throne is your checkbook. Another throne is your playbook. Another throne is your workbook. And a final throne is your Facebook. When you open your checkbook, you're going to find your priorities. And as you look it over in your online statements, do you see more Caesar, exalting himself, or do you see more Christ, giving to others? Who's enthroned in your checkbook? Who's enthroned in your bank account? Who's enthroned in your stewardship? Christmas is the greatest gift, a God who had everything and gave it all for us. And if we are walking in his procession, we should do the same. How about your playbook? What is your normal playbook for how you handle yourself? If I talk to your employees, if I talk to your boss, if I talk to your colleagues, would they say there's something about you? It's different. It's not about taking credit and spreading blame. If anything, it's the opposite. You take more blame than you should, and you spread more credit than you ought. There's a totally different type of mindset I smell and I see. It's like you're following a totally different playbook than what the culture teaches. Somebody is enthroned in your heart. How about your workbook? The way you go about work, the way you think about work, the way you interact with people at work. Does your workbook show that you work under the Lord? You've got a boss that is really hard to work with, and yet you submit, and yet you're kind, and yet you don't gossip, because you want to walk the triumph with a different kind of king who did not revile those who reviled him, but instead entrusted himself to him who judges righteously. Who's enthroned in your Facebook? The relationships in your life. Do you use relationships as a chance to post how great you are and how great your kids are? Or is it a chance to be real? Or do you in your relationships get annoyed and criticize those people who use their Facebook to brag about how great their lives are? Does your relationships, the Facebooks in your life, show gentleness, kindness, sacrifice? Or does it show self-exaltation and braggadociousness? See, it's our relationships that show who's enthroned in our life. Do we forgive? Do we accept? Do we encourage? And do we reconcile? This was a challenging week for me. I spent more time trying to live a sermon than to prepare a sermon. Through a whole series of my own deficiencies, which is a long list, I unfortunately broke the trust of a good friend. So God says when that happens, you put everything on hold, you make it right. And through a whole series of my deficiencies, one of which is I go too fast, and when I go too fast, I don't communicate well. When I don't communicate well, my lack of attention to detail sort of comes out worse than ever. And another deficiency is I still try and live my life not fully appreciating the limits of having a special needs family, and a special needs child. And all those came together to break the trust of a friend. And I spent the week trying to reestablish, explain, take ownership and responsibility, and pursue forgiveness and ask for forgiveness for the culmination of my weaknesses. And through God's grace in the midst of it, I feel like God made some huge steps. The story's not over, but my heart was just broken. And by what my weaknesses could do to hurt someone else. And I've likened having a special needs son to parenting a tornado or raising a Tasmanian angel. There's a little kind little guy inside, but just in the last 24 hours, I had to run up to Dayton to get gymnasium pads because we've got to repad his bedroom because he's bashing his head in the wall again. We had to put plexiglass up on the balcony because he was trying to throw himself off. And just a few days ago, he ripped that off, and so we had to replace that. Just in a moment of like, okay, dinner's getting ready, send him outside. Now, as we're making lunch, oh my goodness, he's taken all his clothes off. Somebody needs to go out and take care of that. Comes back inside, and one of the melatonin medicine that he takes at night was left out, so he ate it. And so then he falls asleep in the middle of the day, which he hates, and he gets angry, and he wakes up in turmoil. And just as we're about to come to church last night, we couldn't because of that. And then instead of Beth and Quinn being able to join me, she's at home with him screaming for an hour because of the ramifications of that. And that's just one day. It's a glorious idea to sacrifice, to give, to adopt, to help. But most sacrifice is just hard work. It's saying, I want to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. I want people to smell in my life, not that I'm perfect, but that I take ownership for what I do, that I sacrifice not once, but every day. I sacrifice on behalf of my spouse, on behalf of my friends, on behalf of my employees. I'm walking in a triumph. And I want people to see there's something about my life that's real, something about my life that speaks to my King. The band comes up, I want you to see how Paul says it in 2 Corinthians. So maybe it'll bring new meaning to you. He says, thanks be to God, who always leads us in life in triumph in Christ. We are walking through this life in triumph with Him. And through us, through you and me, He is diffusing the fragrance of His knowledge in every place. The fragrance of forgiveness, the fragrance of reconciliation, the fragrance of generosity, the fragrance of other-centeredness. And who's He dispersing the smell to? For we are to God the fragrance of Christ among those who are being saved, those who are convinced, and those who are unconvinced, those who are perishing. God, may we be representatives of the King we serve. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the kingdom of heaven and the ultimate King of heaven that's called us this Christmas season to live a different type of life. In Jesus' name, amen.